Hi everyone, I'm Liz.
I'm Eamonn.
And we're with Village Wealth, and welcome to the 7-Minute Takeover where we chat all things acquisitions. Today we're taking a topic specific to small business acquisitions about how to measure cash flow to determine valuation and affordability for an acquisition. The primary measures of cash flow used for buyers and sellers tends to be normalized EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, plus a market rate salary for a new owner, or seller's discretionary earnings, EBITDA plus compensation paid to the owner, commonly referred to as SDE in small business.
Sorry to jump in, but you know how much I disliked the idea of seller's discretionary earnings. When I first joined Village, I spent 12 years in public markets M&A and commercial lending, and I had never even heard the term prior to moving over to Village and getting into this segment. Since then, I've really come around to the usefulness of the metric, but it took some convincing. My aha moment was when I saw just the vast disparity between how owners would compensate themselves, either through dividends, large salaries. It really was different from business to business. Firstly, let's take a step back. Why do we use EBITDA in the first place? It's not a real measure of cash flow. You have to pay interest, you have to pay taxes. The way I like to think about EBITDA is if you took a company and shot it up into space, they didn't have things like financing their debt, they didn't have capital expenditure needs, they didn't have tax regimes. And so it's these assets on their own, how much cash would they generate independent of all of these other kind of options that an owner has? And then we typically would add back a normalized number for a new operator's salary. So SDE actually just becomes a bit of a natural extension to that. One of the choices that an owner makes is how much to pay themselves and how to pay themselves. So we want to strip that away when looking at a company for the purpose of acquisition, because you may not need to pay yourself a normalized rate. You may need to pay yourself more. You may need to pay yourself less. And so, this is actually going to give you a better blank slate to start your analysis of cash flow available.
Okay, so SDE may be a better way to measure cash flow for small businesses when the owner's involved. But how should buyers and sellers determine when to use normalized EBITDA and when to use SDE?
Okay, so I think there's two questions here. One is valuation and one is really just affordability. So let's start with valuation. Given the valuation is more of an art than a science, it actually is helpful to have a couple of metrics. So using both EBITDA, maybe a 3 to 4 times multiple on that, or SDE and applying a 2 to 3 times multiple may be standard in the industry. And that gives you a couple of goalposts that you can kind of see, okay, what valuation makes sense. I still recommend primarily basing valuation on an EBITDA figure, since again, the owner operator compensation can vary so dramatically. And so SDE can be a bit more skewed based on, how the owner has compensated themselves.
Okay, so when buying, it's pretty important to understand both metrics then and both measurements and how the owner arrived at both is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, for valuation, again, it's a bit of a triangulation exercise. From an affordability perspective, I actually now believe SDE is the more useful measure. It doesn't really matter if the normal executive salary would be $100,000 to do what the owner previously did. If you only need to pay yourself $70,000, or maybe you need to pay yourself $200,000. So really, it again gives you that blank slate to layer the assumptions on in terms of how much debt financing you're going to take on, how much you're going to pay yourself, how you're going to finance future capital acquisitions.
Great. That's an awesome explanation. Okay, so I want to understand as a buyer, I want to understand what role the previous owner is playing in the business, what it may take to replace them. So if I'm stepping in, where my role falls in relation to theirs as they're exiting, and where all the measurement is coming from. Okay, wonderful.
And so I'd say EBITDA for valuation, SDE for cash flow. There are many other measures of cash flow that a buyer is going to come across, and it's important to understand that they all play a different.
Well, that's just a starting point. We know this is a much deeper topic, but that gives a bit of a snapshot into the small business earnings calculation. So If you want to learn more, keep tuning in. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And thanks very much, Eamonn.
See you next time.
Bye, everybody.